Going on to part 2 of the World Center of Classical Guitar Activity, Buenos Aires, its guitars and owners. I would like to quote from Historia Universal de la Guitarra by Ricardo Munoz. Back about 2010, I purchased 7 volumes of that he produced between March of 1935 and September of 1957. And I gave him credit on every page, just like page 1940 here. This is translated from Ricardo Munoz's unpublished book, Historia Universal de la Guitarra, Volume 8, La Escuela Tática en la Argentina. It's from my book, 4 volumes, 21 pounds, Annotations for the History of the Classical Guitar in Argentina, 1822 to 2000. This book's been very well received. It got reviewed by the late David Grimes in Soundboard magazine last spring, and in July of last year in Gendai Guitar magazine, that's been around since I think about 1967. In Tokyo it was published, a 4-page review. And so what I want to do is read about the guitar owners. And so this goes from page 1939 to page 1942. And so in volume 7, Ricardo Munoz put guitars and their owners. Luis Martin Castellano is the owner of a Antonio de Torres, Antonio Emilio Pascual Viudas, and 2 guitars by Manuel Ramirez. Luis Martin Castellano was the appraiser for the bank when instruments were auctioned off, such as the Targa Torres that came in 1918 to Buenos Aires, bought by Juan Carlos Anido for his daughter Maria Luisa Anido, who had studied with Domingo Prat and was presently at that time studying with Josefina Robledo when Miguel Ube was not in town to give her lessons. He was the appraiser for the auctions that took place, and he was a very knowledgeable player, and he had been doing that since about 1923, but it was 1939 that the guitar by Torres became available to the general public. Pedro Herrera owned a Rodolfo Camacho guitar and Juan Galan or Rafael Galan guitar. It's not stated as to which, but those guys had studied with Antonio Lorca Pino, in the 1890s. Martin Ruiz Moreno, born 1833, died 1919. He owned an Antonio Torres guitar that belonged to Don Bernardo Troncoso. Martin Ruiz Moreno was a sheet music collector, and he inspired Eleuterio Tiscornia to continue collecting. Tiscornia's collection was bought by Robert Spencer, and that eventually became varieties of Chanterelle publications, complete 9-volume, Cost, Aguado, Soar, you name it. All that stuff was collected by Eleuterio Tiscornia, who died, I think, in 1945, and his book was put out by his children in 1948. Wenceslau Escalante was a lawyer who owned Antonio de Torres guitars. He owned 2 of them. Now in the possession of his family. Important musical archive of the instrument also contains manuscripts of Tratado de Armonia, Aplicado a la Guitarra, written by Troncoso. Wenceslau Escalante passed away the 3rd of August 1901. He was such a well-known character in the Guitar Society that there would be full-page caricatures, dibujos, sketches of him in Caras y Caretas magazine. So there's one of those in, I think, volume 1 of my book, page 63 or something. You have Luis Cordero, grandson of Dr. Fernando Cruz Cordero, the first guitarist to write a method book in Argentina in the 1840s. He owns a guitar from his grandfather, also one by Enrique Garcia. Garcia's guitars sold like hotcakes. He had two models, basically sold for $1,000 and $1,500 at the Romero Agra Mayor store, which became later Romero and Fernandez. He was the secretary of Sociedad La Guitarra, founded by Juan Carlos Anido during World War I period. Juan Manuel de Rosas owned a guitar constructed in Cadiz. This is now in the National Museum, Museo Nacional. Justo Jose de Urquiza owned a rosewood guitar made by Mateo Benedid in Cadiz, made at Calle San Agustin, number 76. In the mid-1990s, the late Frank Wallace purchased a Mateo Benedid guitar that I had that was rosewood back and sides. It had the thickest bass tone. It was my favorite guitar. I only had it a few weeks. Eleuterio Tisconia, born in 1879, passed away July 1945. He owned an 1864 Antonio de Torres guitar and an 11-string call guitar made in Barcelona. The architect Luis Obligado left 5 guitars, one to each of his children. Antonio de Torres, Pages constructed in 1780. A third says Guzman Fabricante de Guitarras, Buenos Aires, 1858. Details of the last 2 are unknown. He had many very rare Fernando Sor pieces of sheet music in his archive that went into the hands of Eleuterio Tisconia. Martin Heel was the owner of a magnificent Enrique Garcia. Martin Heel was an astronomer who had his caricature in the Caras y Caretas magazines. Dr. Martin Ruiz Moreno owned Antonio de Torres, brought by Bernardo Troncoso in 1895 when he made a voyage to Spain. And that's a duplicate. I read about that earlier. Juan Veyer owned an Antonio de Torres that he brought to Buenos Aires in 1878. Juan Veyer had an early version of the Spanish Romance. That was written by Antonio Rubera. Me and Rico Stover back in 2013 spent hours and hours putting together the history of that. Rico said, I've got over 200 emails written to you on the subject of that. Juan Elias, who I mentioned the other day, was passing out flyers at the age of 70, come see this great Domingo Prat concert where he played an Enrique Garcia guitar that he brought with him and arrived on January 1st, 1908. So he had a special guitar by Francisco Nunez. The rosette had a mosaic that read Construida para Don Juan Elias Francisco Nunez. Instrument was acquired by Don Guillermo Valdez when Elias suffered his paralysis in 1910. Elias, he was born in 1838. He passed away in 1914. Domingo Prat put a gravestone on his place where he rests in peace for over a century now. I wrote from, so all I've spoken so far is from Volume 7 of Historia Universal de la Guitarra en la Argentina, written by Ricardo Munoz. And then I quote Cedar Villietti, Origen y Historia de la Guitarra, published by editorial Albatross in Buenos Aires in 1973. Viglietti says on page 185, Louis Paquette, a guy that knew Agustin Barrios, owned a Salvador Ramirez guitar given to him by General Julio Roca. Eduardo Fabini, quoted on page 193, owned a Simplicio on 216. Umberto Ponte owned the guitars by Santos Hernandez, Simplicio, and Enrique Garcia. On page 229, Mario Parente Amaro owned a Hauser. Segovia was the guy that got the Hausers into the Rio de la Plata area. You could go to the Palacio de Musica in Montevideo and get a Hauser. He was kind of the middleman agent on getting those brought. On the next page, page 1940 of my book, Annotations of the History of the Classical Guitar, we continue with Ricardo Munoz, Historia Universal de la Guitarra, Volume 8, La Escuela Targa en la Argentina. Saverio Cucci owned a Antonio Emilio Pascual Viudis number 215, made in 1928. Pedro Herrera owned a Rodolfo Camacho Vieira number 216, made in 1940. Agustin Barrios owned one. He visited the workshop. Andres Segovia owned two, the first one being made in 1928, the second in 1934. Both were purchased in the hotel room where the maestro was staying. Unlike Agustin Barrios, Andres Segovia never visited the workshop of Rodolfo Camacho Vieira. We find those, I've sold two of them, 1927 and one from 1969 that belonged to Maria Angelica Funes, who was a Pratt student, etc. In December of the same year, let me back up here. Francisco Estrada Diaz made instruments in Rosario from 1921 onward. In the year 1955, Maria Luisa Nido said, "These guitars are of an expressive and vibrant sound. Voices are of extremely balanced basses and trebles. Besides, it has most comfortable tension, without which the purity of sound would suffer from it. An extraordinary thing, especially in the strength of the volume." There are ads for Francisco Estrada Diaz in the La Guitarra magazines published by Juan Carlos Anido. Those were from 1921 to 1924, 6 issues. I quote heavily from that when applicable to the particular biography that I was extrapolating on. In December of the same year, 1921, Domingo Mercado said, in 1955, Domingo Mercado said, "I am impressed by the sonority and by the uniformity with which the registers yield and the exquisiteness of tone color, where the player acquires without a major effort all the expressive effects that these instruments must store up for the liberty and brilliance of the performer." Justo T. Morales, he did concerts with Ricardo Munoz from 1917 onward. We show the concert programs in the book. There's 3,200 images and photos in my 4 volumes of the Annotations for the History of the Classical Guitar in Argentina, 1822 to 2000. And Morales owned a Santos until the end of his life in 1953. In fact, in our book we have a Justo T. Morales invitation to the funeral or the wake. His student Elba Rosado de Biancato owned instruments by Manuel Dominguez, Antigua Casa Nunez, and Ricardo Munoz. Munoz came up with a guitar that became played on concert stages in Argentina and in Montevideo. This is documented in the book. Various guitar makers made his design, from Eugene Pierny to Diego, who ran the Antigua Casa Nunez shop. Adolfo V. Luna owned a 1904 Enrique Garcia number 43 that belonged to Maestro Tarraga. Roberto Soriano owned 2 guitars by Santos Hernandez and Antonio Torres, and a 4th guitar made by Antigua Casa Nunez. Richard Bernay, my colleague, did an article in Vintage Guitar magazine about one of the guitars that Roberto Soriano owned of Santos Hernandez, a very ornate guitar. This guitar is described in the Domingo Prat Diccionario de Guitarristas as well. Students of Domingo Prat, Leandro Castro owned a Francisco Simplicio number 99. Francisco Del Bene owned 2 guitars by Galan, unknown as to whether it was by Rafael, the son of Juan, or Juan himself, the father. One by Casa Romero and Fernandez, one made by Pedro Testori. Testori had 2 daughters, Magdalena and Victoria. They both were child prodigies that had their faces in small articles in full pages of Caras y Carretas magazines. That was a weekly magazine size of TV Guide that came out every week, 80 pages. I was thinking the other day, wow, the editor had to keep everybody working on everything so that you could fill up that 80 pages, 120 pages every week. And so Francisco Del Bene, he was a Domingo Prat student. And he owned one also by Casa Nunez, one by Hilario Caracedo, and Casa Uprano, and 3 of unknown construction. Roberto M. Iglesias, who was a member of Abel Flores Escuadrones de Guitarras, squadrons of guitars, owned models by Simplicio, Sinopoli, Ramirez, and Ricardo Munoz. Sinopoli came up with a imitation of the doble boca, the 2 mouths guitar that Francisco Simplicio showed at the Barcelona exposition and won an award in 1929. Eduardo Ben Sidone, who has an archive. I bought a dozen archives. How did this book come together? I spent over $90,000 buying the archives. From August of 1999 to the last archive being bought in 2015. Eduardo Ben Sidone owned instruments such as the 1908 Ramirez Francisco Simplicio number 56 from 1928 and a G Torres from 1906. Ben Sidone had articles he contributed to Wilfred Appleby's Guitar News magazine, to BMG magazine, both being published in London in the 40s and 50s. Irma Heidi Perazzo owned a guitar by Santos Hernandez and also one by Rodolfo Camacho Vieira. In her bio, we have photos that show the Rodolfo Camacho Vieira guitar as well. Consuelo Maya Lopez, you can go on YouTube and watch videos from about 1972 where she has students performing classical guitar pieces. Consuelo Maya Lopez, she did complete Bach concerts in 1934. We have these programs in this book. It was a joy to write this book. I spent 17 years on it, from September 2000 until about 2019. It was a time where I had to stop working on the book to study violin makers. I would have been forced into retirement because millennials don't play guitars, flamenco guitars especially. Lots of dealers used to carry a dozen flamencos. Now they carry none because millennials don't have any interest in history or Spanish history. They're not interested in flamenco guitars. There are very few that do, and we're all glad to see those customers when they do come in. But I had to study violins. I started selling violins in 2014. If I didn't do so, I would have been forced into retirement. Probably never would have been able to publish the book. I've sold 135 violins in the last 5 years, 61 cellos, 12 basses, and 12 violas, and 160 guitars just in the last 5 years. But you can't sell 160 guitars only and keep a shop open for 8 years. It just doesn't happen. I run this shop by myself. Child prodigy of Domingo Prata, Delfina Wright-Seen, who became Monina Tavora when she moved to Brazil, who took regular lessons from also Maestro Segovia. She owned a Herman Hauser one guitar. If you put in her name On YouTube, you can get to listen to some very evocative playing on her Hauser guitar. She is a very noteworthy person. We have page after page on her career. She taught the Abro brothers and the Assad brothers in Brazil. Those brothers got 3-hour classes every day with her. This is documented in the book. You need to get this book. It's $300 plus tax. That'll include the shipping in the United States and to most places in the world. If it runs me $60 to send you this 4-volume series to Japan, you're covered. Same cost, $327.70 out the door. I do have problems sending stuff to Belgium. Cost me $170 shipping. I can't cover that, but I will cover American $35 shipping cost included in the purchase. Just buy it on PayPal. It's on the bottom of the home page. Let's continue here. The next page shows a Wampage's guitar from 1787. And this was documented in a Caras y Carretas magazine from March 31st of 1917. And it took up over half a page. And that was in the possession of Mr. Carvajal. So we turn the page and we are on the last of the guitars and their owners. So to continue from volume 5 of Historia Universal de la Guitarra by Ricardo Munoz, Juan Ruano, who was the secretary of the Peña Guitarrística Tárrega in Barcelona, owned an Enrique Sanfilio guitar and a 1919 Enrique Garcia, number 213. I've mentioned at least a dozen Enrique Garcia guitars today, owned by great players. Juan Ruano was a friend of Ricardo Munoz. He sent a photograph of Andres Segovia in a bathing suit. You know, the 1930s where the top and the trunks are all one piece. He was standing in the water off of Barcelona or somewhere. And he sent that in the 50s. Carmen Gonzalez owned a Vicente Arias guitar, which she used at the age of 11. Celedonio Romero owned guitars by Torres, Ramirez, Santos Hernandez, and others. Why is he mentioned? Because, as I mentioned, this Historia Universal de la Guitarra book was written between March 1935 and September of 1957. So Celedonio Romero and his children, which became world famous after they came to the United States, this is documenting guitars that he owned before 1957. Torres guitar, Ramirez, Santos Hernandez. Jose Navas Garcia, who taught at the Conservatory of Malaga. Jack Buckingham studied with him. Jack Buckingham was an American guitarist who published, I think, the book Flamenco with Tears. Jack taught at the Laney Merritt College in Oakland. And his was the first archive I acquired in 1993. I have a 3-page letter written 1953 by Marcelo Barbero, mentions 3 models, prices quoted, etc. So he studied with Jose Navas Garcia, who owned guitars by Ramirez, Lorca, and Dominguez. Pretty easy to get a Lorca guitar if you lived in Malaga. Also, Dominguez was a student of Lorca as well. Juan Parras del Moral owned guitars by Pages, Garcia, and Simplicio. Juan Parras del Moral recorded 78s in the 1930s and probably used his Garcia or Simplicio guitars in those recordings. Bartolome Calatayud Cerda owned guitars by Pages, Ramirez, Casanovas. Casanovas was of a family that worked in Mallorca and others. Pepita Roca owned guitars by Pascual Roche. Roche put out a 3-volume method, somewhat well known. He was a Tárrega student and even had some Tárrega transcripts put into standard notation in the latter part of one of the volumes. And he also owned a Enrique Garcia. Pepito Roca also owned a Enrique Garcia guitar. Mariano Cubas Martin owned guitars by Torres, Garcia, Ramirez, Santos Hernandez, Lorca, Urente, Rodriguez, and Newman Hauser. And so that's the end of the Historia Universal de la Guitarra, Volume 5, Los Contemporáneos contribution. Then we're back to Cedar Viglietti Uri in the Historia de la Guitarra from 1973. Urbano Fabini, our most important musician, had among others Simplicio. Fabini did duets with Agustin Barrios, I think 1923, something like that. So that is my contribution. You can look forward to another video I'm planning to do soon, and it's on Antonio de Torres and those that owned his guitars. And this will be, it's part of my book. It's taken from the Diccionario de Guitarristas by Domingo Prat, published by Fernandez Music House Publishing in 1934 in Buenos Aires. Thank you.